I'm Hazel Peterson, 32 years old, standing at my brother Jeffrey's extravagant wedding reception, with a knot in my stomach that tightens every time I look at my father. Just moments ago, he publicly humiliated my fiancé Marcus by dismissing him as just a trash collector to his wealthy friends. If he only knew that the environmental empire he built stands on the same ground that Marcus helped save. Now I have a choice to make that could change our family forever. If you're watching this from a place where family has judged your choices, drop your location in the comments and hit subscribe to follow my journey of standing up for true love. Growing up as a Peterson meant expectations, high ones. Our family home in Greenwich, Connecticut was a sprawling colonial mansion with manicured gardens and a view of Long Island Sound that guests would marvel at during my father's frequent business parties. Arthur Peterson. My father wasn't just wealthy. He was Connecticut royalty, a real estate developer, whose name appeared on luxury buildings across 3 states. When people talked about success, they pointed to my father. My mother, Diana, was the perfect counterpart to his ambition. Beautiful, poised, and ruthlessly committed to social climbing, she arranged our lives around appearances and connections. Her days were filled with charity boards, social clubs, and organizing events that would guarantee photos in local society pages. My childhood memories are punctuated by her constant reminders about appropriate behavior for a Peterson. Then there was Jeffrey, my brother, 3 years older, and seemingly born to inherit our father's empire. He had my father's tall frame, confident handshake, and natural aptitude for making people feel important when needed. Since childhood, Jeffrey shadowed our father, attending business meetings during school breaks and learning to talk about investment opportunities before he even had his driver's license. Father beamed with pride, watching Jeffrey charm potential investors, often saying, "The apple doesn't fall far from the tree." And then there was me. From the beginning, I was different. Where Jeffrey saw dollar signs, I saw ecological systems. While my family discussed property values, I worried about wetland conservation and carbon footprints. My bedroom wasn't decorated with fashion posters, but with diagrams of ecosystems and photos of endangered species. By 13, I was organizing neighborhood cleanups, while my mother struggled to understand why her daughter preferred mud boots to designer shoes. "Hazel, darling," she would say, pinching the bridge of her nose, "it's wonderful that you care about the environment, but couldn't you channel that energy into something more presentable? Perhaps starting an upscale recycling program for the country club." My father was less diplomatic. "This tree-hugging phase needs to end," he told me after I protested against his company clearing a local woodland for a new development. "Petersons build things, Hazel. We don't chain ourselves to trees." Senior year of high school brought the first major battle. While my parents assumed I would attend my father's alma mater to study business or perhaps law, I announced my intention to major in environmental engineering at Washington State University, clear across the country from Connecticut. "Environmental what?" My father had asked, his face flushing red. "Absolutely not. No daughter of mine is throwing away her future on some hippie degree." The argument lasted weeks. My mother tried a softer approach, bringing home brochures from Ivy League schools and arranging lunches with the daughters of her friends who had chosen sensible careers. Jeffrey, to his credit, privately told me to follow my passion, but warned me about the consequences of defying our father. In the end, my academic scholarship to Washington State settled the matter. My father couldn't argue with free tuition, though he made it clear this was my choice, and therefore my burden to bear. The night before I left for Seattle, he sat me down in his wood-paneled study. "You're choosing a difficult path, Hazel," he said, swirling his scotch. "When you realize this was a mistake, you'll always have a place in the family business." Seattle was freedom. For the first time, I was judged on my ideas and work ethic, not my family name or social connections. Graduate studies followed undergraduate, and I thrived in research projects focused on sustainable urban development. My papers were published in environmental journals, and I began building a reputation in the field that had nothing to do with being Arthur Peterson's daughter. Back home, my visits became increasingly tense. Holiday dinners were battlegrounds of passive-aggressive comments about my interesting career choice, and my mother's thinly veiled attempts to introduce me to suitable young men from families in their social circle. "The Whittington boy just made partner at his father's firm," she would say casually over Thanksgiving turkey. "He's single, you know. Ivy educated. They have the summer home in Martha's Vineyard. I would smile tightly and redirect the conversation. But the message was clear: I was failing to live up to family expectations. Through it all, Jeffrey remained my ally, though a cautious one. He had followed our father's path perfectly, joining the family business after getting his MBA, and quickly proving himself capable of expanding the Peterson real estate empire. When we spoke on the phone, he would tell me about his latest projects while I shared my research breakthroughs, each of us respecting the other's choices, even if we didn't fully understand them. Then came the announcement that Jeffrey was engaged to Sophia Hamilton, daughter of one of the oldest banking families in New England. My mother was ecstatic, immediately diving into plans for what she called the social event of the season. My father approved wholeheartedly, seeing the union as both personally and professionally advantageous. The Hamiltons were old money with connections that even the Petersons could benefit from. I was happy for Jeffrey. Sophia seemed genuine during our few meetings, intelligent and kind, beneath the polished exterior that came with her upbringing. They looked at each other with real affection, not just the calculated partnership I had witnessed in many of my parents' friends' marriages. But as wedding plans progressed, and my mother's calls became increasingly focused on what I would wear and who I would bring, I felt the familiar pressure returning. This time, however, I wasn't alone. I had Marcus, and introducing him to my family would prove to be the catalyst that would change everything. I met Marcus Johnson on a rainy Tuesday in Seattle. I was 3 years into my position with the city's Environmental Protection Agency, leading a project to revitalize contaminated industrial areas into sustainable community spaces. That particular morning, I was on site at an old manufacturing district, clipboard in hand, squinting through the drizzle at soil testing markers. "You might want to shift those about 10 feet west," came a voice behind me. "The drainage patterns suggest the contamination flow would concentrate there." I turned to see a tall black man in a city sanitation department jacket, rain beating on his close-cropped hair. His smile was warm but professional as he extended his hand. "Marcus Johnson, Waste Management Division. I've been assigned to consult on your reclamation project." My first impression, I'm embarrassed to admit, was confusion. I had expected the waste management consultant to be an office type with charts and presentations, not someone who appeared to work directly in sanitation. Shows what I knew. "Hazel Peterson," I replied, shaking his hand. "I appreciate the input, but we've done extensive modeling on the contamination spread." "Based on surface indicators, sure," he nodded, pulling out a tablet protected in a heavy-duty case. "But I've been monitoring the underground water table movement in this area for 5 years. Your models are missing some key variables." He swiped through several screens of data that contradicted our findings. I was simultaneously annoyed and intrigued. Annoyed because our team had spent months on those models, but intrigued because his analysis made perfect sense. "Would you mind walking me through this?" I asked, professional curiosity overcoming my initial defensiveness. That first meeting turned into a 3-hour tour of the site, with Marcus explaining patterns of industrial waste migration, with the kind of expertise that only comes from hands-on experience, combined with deep technical knowledge. By the end, I had filled my notebook with revisions to our approach and gained a new respect for the sanitation department's role in environmental protection. What I didn't expect was that this would be the beginning of a collaboration that would transform both the project and my life. Over the following weeks, Marcus became an essential consultant to our team. He had an uncanny ability to predict how different waste materials would behave in various environments, saving us countless hours of trial and error. One evening, as we were wrapping up a particularly productive planning session, I decided to satisfy my curiosity. "Marcus, I hope this isn't offensive, but you seem overqualified for your position. Your understanding of chemical interactions and environmental engineering is at least master's level." He laughed, not at all offended. "I actually have 2 master's degrees, environmental science from Oregon State and chemical engineering from MIT, and 3 patents on sustainable waste processing systems." "What?" I was genuinely shocked. "Then why are you—" "Working in sanitation," he finished for me. "Because I believe in getting my hands dirty. Literally. Too many environmental solutions fail because the people designing them never experience the real-world conditions they're meant for." As we packed up our materials, he explained how he'd started his career in corporate consulting, but became frustrated with creating solutions that looked good on paper, but fell apart in implementation. He had deliberately sought a position that would allow him to work directly with waste management systems while influencing policy and design. My mother raised me to value practical knowledge, he said as we walked to the parking lot. She cleaned office buildings at night while putting herself through nursing school. She taught me that no honest work is beneath anyone, and that real expertise comes from understanding systems from the ground up. His perspective was refreshing and challenged my own thinking about environmental work. Before long, our professional meetings extended to coffee discussions, then dinner debates about sustainability approaches, and finally weekend hikes where we talked about everything from childhood memories to future dreams. I learned that Marcus had grown up in Oakland, raised by his single mother, after his father died when he was 8. Despite financial struggles, his mother had fostered his natural curiosity and talent for science. He'd worked his way through community college before earning scholarships to fund his further education. The patents he'd mentioned so casually were actually revolutionary designs for municipal waste processing that reduced energy consumption while increasing recycling efficiency. Several cities across the country were implementing his systems, though he spoke about this accomplishment with characteristic modesty. 6 months into our friendship during a sunset kayaking trip on Puget Sound, our relationship shifted from colleagues to something more. As we watched the light change over the Olympic Mountains, our conversation had turned personal. "You know what I admire about you, Hazel?" Marcus said, his kayak gently drifting beside mine. "You could have used your family connections for an easy career path, but you chose to build something on your own merits." I was surprised. "How did you know about my family?" He grinned. "I Googled you after our first meeting. The Peterson real estate empire isn't exactly low profile, but you never mention it. Because it's not relevant to who I am or what I do," I replied, feeling strangely vulnerable, that he knew this part of my life I kept separate from my Seattle existence. "Exactly," he said softly. "You're authentic in a way most people aren't brave enough to be." Something in his gaze made my heart race, and when he reached across the small space between our kayaks to take my hand, I knew we had crossed into new territory. Our first kiss happened right there on the water, with the city lights beginning to twinkle behind us and the sound of gentle waves against our boats. The transition from colleagues to partners felt natural, as if we'd been moving in this direction all along. Our work together continued, but now our evenings and weekends were filled with discovering each other's lives beyond environmental engineering. I introduced Marcus to my favorite bookstores and hiking trails. He taught me to cook his mother's jambalaya recipe and took me to community jazz performances where he knew the musicians by name. 2 years into our relationship, during a camping trip to Olympic National Park, Marcus proposed at sunrise on Hurricane Ridge, with wildflowers and mountains stretching endlessly before us. The ring was modest but beautiful, a recycled gold band with a small emerald that had belonged to his grandmother. "I know I'm not what your family would choose for you," he said as I wiped happy tears away. "But I promise to build a life with you that matters, that makes a difference in this world." "You're exactly what I choose," I told him, kissing him with all the certainty in my heart. The joy of our engagement was tempered only by my anxiety about introducing Marcus to my family. Our visits to Connecticut had become increasingly rare over the years, limited mostly to major holidays, and I had deliberately avoided bringing anyone home to meet my parents since the disaster of introducing them to my college boyfriend, who had been subjected to subtle but unmistakable questioning about his family's lack of pedigree. When I called my mother to share the news of our engagement, her response was predictably measured. "Engaged. Well, that's sudden. And who is this young man again? What did you say his family does?" "His name is Marcus Johnson," I repeated patiently. "He's brilliant, Mom. He works in sustainable waste management systems and has literally revolutionized how cities process recyclables." "Waste management?" she echoed faintly. "I see. Well, we'll have to arrange for you both to visit. Your father will want to meet him." That visit had been brief and uncomfortable. My father had barely spoken directly to Marcus, despite his attempts to engage in conversation about sustainable building practices that might interest a developer. My mother had been politely distant, asking surface-level questions while clearly cataloging everything about Marcus that didn't fit their expectations, from his public education to his choice to work in the field, rather than in a prestigious office position. After that visit, we had kept our distance, focusing on building our life in Seattle. Marcus never complained about my family's reception, but I saw the hurt beneath his understanding. When the elaborate invitation to Jeffrey's wedding arrived, I initially considered declining, but Marcus, ever wiser than me, suggested we should go. "Your brother has always supported you," he reminded me. "And this is a significant moment in his life. Don't let your parents' attitudes rob you of that relationship." So we had accepted. And now we were headed back to Connecticut, to the world I had left behind, with no idea how the decision would ultimately reshape all our lives. The wedding invitation arrived on a Tuesday, a thick cream envelope with gold embossing, and a wax seal bearing the Peterson family crest. Inside was an elaborate multi-page announcement declaring the union of Jeffrey Arthur Peterson and Sophia Elizabeth Hamilton at the historic Peterson estate, with reception to follow. The RSVP card politely requested a response regarding Ms. Hazel Peterson and guest. I stood in our apartment kitchen, the invitation in one hand, my coffee mug in the other, feeling the familiar weight of family expectations pressing down. Marcus came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist and reading over my shoulder. "Wow," he whistled low. "That's quite a production. When did weddings start needing their own press kits?" I laughed despite my unease. "Welcome to the world of Peterson Hamilton social events. This is actually restrained by their standards." I set the invitation aside, trying to ignore it, but later that evening, my phone rang with Jeffrey's name on the screen. Hearing my brother's voice brought back a rush of childhood memories. "Little sister," he said warmly, "did you get the wedding novel we sent out?" "It's currently weighing down my coffee table," I confirmed. "Congratulations, Jeff. Sophia seems wonderful." "She is," he said, and I could hear the genuine happiness in his voice. "Listen, Hayes, I'm calling because I want to make sure you're coming and bringing Marcus." I hesitated. "Jeff, you know how Mom and Dad can be. The last thing I want is to create tension at your wedding." "It's important to me that you're both there," he insisted. "I've talked to Mom and Dad. They'll be on their best behavior." "Their best behavior still involves looking at Marcus like he's something they found on the bottom of their shoe," I pointed out. Jeffrey sighed. "Give them a chance, Hazel. People can change. Besides, it's my wedding and I want my sister and her fiancé there. Please." How could I refuse? Despite our different paths, Jeffrey had always been my advocate in the family in his own careful way. 2 weeks later, Marcus and I were boarding a plane to Connecticut, him in the crisp suit he wore for professional presentations. Me already feeling like I was putting on my old skin as I packed the designer dress my mother had insisted on sending for the rehearsal dinner. "You know what I keep thinking about," Marcus said as we flew over the Midwest. "That night you told me about building forts with Jeffrey in your father's study when you were kids. How you'd steal his fancy fountain pens to draw treasure maps." I smiled at the memory. Jeff would always return them perfectly clean before Dad noticed. He was covering for me even then. "That's the family I want to meet," Marcus said, squeezing my hand. "The real people beneath all the status anxiety." Marcus's optimism lightened my mood, but it was short-lived. The reality of returning home hit as soon as our taxi turned through the wrought iron gates of the Peterson estate. The mansion looked exactly as it had during my childhood, imposing colonial architecture, with perfect symmetry, white columns flanking the front entrance, and not a flower out of place in the extensive gardens. My mother greeted us in the foyer, air-kissing my cheeks, and offering Marcus a brief handshake before launching into details about the wedding preparations. My father appeared from his study long enough to clap me on the shoulder and give Marcus a cursory nod before claiming an important call needed his attention. "You'll be in the blue guest room," my mother informed us. "I've arranged for Hazel to spend tomorrow with the bridal party for final fittings. Mr. Johnson, you'll have the day to yourself, I'm afraid. Perhaps you might enjoy the library." "Marcus," I corrected automatically. "His name is Marcus, Mom." Of course, she smiled tightly. Marcus. The rehearsal dinner that evening was held at the Greenwich Country Club, with about 60 close family and friends in attendance. I noticed immediately that Marcus and I were seated at a table far from the family grouping, with distant cousins and business associates who weren't quite important enough for premium placement. Throughout the evening, I watched as my parents circulated introducing various guests to one another, but somehow never bringing anyone to meet Marcus. When I finally managed to pull Jeffrey aside, he looked genuinely apologetic. "I've been trying to run interference," he admitted. "Dad's being stubborn, but I'm working on him. Just give it time." Later, while getting a drink from the bar, I overheard my father responding to a question from one of his golf buddies. "Hazel's date, oh, he's in waste disposal in Seattle." Very civic-minded of her. I nearly dropped my glass. Waste disposal. As if Marcus was driving a garbage truck rather than revolutionizing sustainable waste management systems. The deliberate diminishment made my blood boil, but Marcus's calm hand on my arm steadied me. "Not worth it," he murmured. "This isn't about us. Remember, it's Jeffrey's time." The next day, trapped in a suite at an upscale salon with Sophia, her 5 bridesmaids and my mother for final wedding preparations, I felt increasingly disconnected from the conversations about floral arrangements and honeymoon plans. When I excused myself to use the restroom, I took a detour through a staff hallway and called Marcus. "How's your free day going?" I asked, leaning against the wall. "Educational," he replied, a hint of amusement in his voice. "I've been exploring the family estate. Your father has quite the art collection, very fond of landscapes depicting undeveloped land, ironically." "I'm sorry about all this," I said for what felt like the 100th time. "Stop apologizing," Marcus said gently. "I'm getting a fascinating anthropological study of American upper-class social rituals. Did you know the toilets in the guest bathrooms have heated seats?" His ability to find humor in the situation was one of the countless reasons I loved him. We chatted briefly before I had to return to the bridal preparations, feeling slightly more centered. That evening, after returning to the estate, I found myself alone in the main house while everyone else was occupied with last-minute wedding details. Following a familiar path, I wandered into my father's study, the room that had once seemed so enormous and forbidden in my childhood. Looking for a bathroom, I took a wrong turn and found myself in my father's private study. Memories flooded back as I ran my fingers along the mahogany bookshelves. This room had been strictly off-limits during my childhood, except for special occasions, when my father would summon us to discuss important family matters. As I turned to leave, a framed photograph on my father's desk caught my eye. It was an old family portrait from when Jeffrey and I were teenagers, all of us smiling stiffly in coordinated outfits. Next to it lay my father's leather-bound calendar, open to the current month with the wedding prominently noted. Out of curiosity, I flipped back through the pages, glimpsing the rhythm of my father's life, through his appointments and notes. Suddenly, a notation from 15 years earlier caught my eye. "Riverside Project Final Settlement. Contact Wallace Reed Documentation." Riverside. The name triggered something in my memory, a news story I had followed during high school. There had been a major environmental scandal involving toxic waste dumping in a riverside development. I remembered being upset about it, cutting out newspaper articles for a school project on corporate environmental responsibility. The details were fuzzy, but I recalled that a development company had been implicated in illegally disposing of hazardous materials contaminating groundwater in a predominantly working-class neighborhood. The case had eventually disappeared from the headlines, presumably settled quietly. Could my father's company have been involved? The timing aligned with the expansion of Peterson development into commercial properties. A chill ran down my spine as I carefully took a photo of the calendar page with my phone before returning it exactly as I had found it. That night, while Marcus slept in our guest room, I sat by the window with my laptop searching for information about the Riverside scandal. The more I read, the more my stomach knotted. Peterson Development wasn't directly named in public reports, but a subsidiary company called Riverside Holdings LLC appeared repeatedly in connection with the environmental violations. Further searching revealed that Riverside Holdings had been incorporated just 3 months before the development project began and was dissolved immediately after the settlement. a classic corporate shell game to protect the parent company from liability. The settlement itself had been sealed by the court, but news reports indicated that the cleanup had cost millions and had been contracted to the city's waste management division as part of the agreement. The project supervisor quoted in several articles was named Walter Green, a name I recognized. Marcus had mentioned him as his mentor when he first joined Seattle's waste management department. The pieces were falling into place, forming a picture I didn't want to see. My father's real estate fortune, which had expanded dramatically in the years following the Riverside incident, was built partly on cutting corners with environmental regulations, the very practices I had dedicated my career to fighting against. And in a twist of fate that seemed too coincidental to be true, Marcus had learned his trade from the man who cleaned up one of my father's messes. The universe had a dark sense of humor. Pulling out my phone, I found the business card of an environmental official I had met at a conference the previous year, who had worked in Connecticut before relocating to the West Coast. Despite the late hour, I sent an email asking if he had any knowledge of the Riverside case. To my surprise, my phone rang almost immediately. "Hazel Peterson," came the voice on the other end. "I was wondering when you might start asking questions about your family business. The Riverside case was before my time, but it was legendary in the department. Your father's company got away with murder, metaphorically speaking. The settlement included a gag order for all parties involved." "So it's true," I said, my voice barely audible. "The records are sealed so officially I can't confirm anything," he replied carefully. "But off the record, that case is why I got into environmental protection in the first place. The system failed those people." After hanging up, I sat motionless, staring out at the perfectly manicured grounds of the Peterson estate, seeing them with new eyes. Every pristine hedge, every elegant fountain potentially paid for with money that should have gone to properly disposing of toxic materials, to protecting communities rather than poisoning them. The gentle touch on my shoulder startled me. Marcus stood behind me, concern evident in his eyes. "You've been up for hours," he said softly. "What's going on?" I hesitated only briefly before sharing everything I discovered. Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious. As I connected the dots between his mentor, my father's company, and the environmental disaster that had been buried in legal settlements. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "What do you want to do with this information?" It was the perfect question, focusing not on the shock or anger I felt, but on the path forward. This was why I loved him, his ability to center what mattered. "Part of me wants to confront my father immediately," I admitted, "to call him out on the hypocrisy of looking down on your work when his fortune is built on environmental destruction that people like you had to clean up." Marcus sat beside me, taking my hands in his. "And the other part, knows that doing that would ruin Jeffrey's wedding. He doesn't deserve that." Marcus nodded slowly. "I think you've answered your own question. This information isn't going anywhere. Your brother deserves his day." Looking into his eyes, I saw the wisdom and compassion that had drawn me to him from the beginning. "How did I get so lucky to find you?" I ask myself the same thing every day. He smiled, kissing my forehead. "Come to bed. Tomorrow will be challenging enough without sleep deprivation." I agreed, closing my laptop and following him back to bed. But as I drifted off to sleep, my mind continued to churn with revelations and questions. How would I face my father knowing what I now knew? And how long could I keep this information to myself? The day of Jeffrey's wedding dawned clear and perfect, as if specially ordered by my mother, who had probably lobbied God himself for optimal conditions. From my bedroom window, I watched an army of workers putting final touches on the ceremony site, a flower-covered pergola overlooking the estate's rolling back lawns, and the massive reception tent capable of housing the 300-plus guests expected to attend. Joining the other bridesmaids in Sophia's suite, I was swept into the choreographed chaos of hairstyling, makeup application, and champagne toasts. Sophia looked radiant in her custom gown, a creation of lace and silk that probably cost more than most people's cars. Despite my complicated feelings about the excessive display of wealth surrounding the event, I was genuinely happy for my brother. Sophia's eyes lit up when she talked about Jeffrey, and I knew he felt the same about her. "I'm so glad you're here, Hazel," Sophia said, as we waited for the ceremony to begin. Jeffrey talks about you all the time, you know. He's incredibly proud of your work. Her sincerity touched me. That means a lot. He's lucky to have found you. The ceremony proceeded like a perfectly executed theatrical production. Flower girls scattered rose petals along the white carpet. String quartet music swelled at precisely the right moments. Jeffrey beamed as Sophia walked down the aisle on her father's arm, and even my mother dabbed real tears when they exchanged vows. Standing beside Sophia with the other bridesmaids, I spotted Marcus seated toward the back of the assembled guests. Despite wearing one of his best suits, he had been placed far from the family section, a deliberate positioning that hadn't escaped my notice. Still, he caught my eye and gave me an encouraging smile that steadied my rising irritation. After the ceremony, while the newlyweds took photos, guests migrated to the reception tent for cocktail hour. I broke away from the bridal party as soon as possible to find Marcus, who was standing alone near one of the bars taking in the extravagant surroundings. "This makes the Gatsby party scenes look restrained," he commented, gesturing to the crystal chandeliers hanging from the tent ceiling, the ice sculptures on the seafood tables, and the 20-piece orchestra warming up on a raised platform. I laughed despite myself. "Wait until you see the 5-course dinner and the synchronized dessert presentation." Taking his arm, I guided him through the growing crowd, introducing him to a few distant relatives and old friends who seemed genuinely interested in meeting him. But I couldn't help noticing how my father maneuvered around the tent, introducing important business contacts to Jeffrey and Sophia, while conspicuously avoiding our vicinity. When dinner was announced, I discovered we had been seated at a table far from the wedding party dais, with my mother's second cousins and a few work associates of my father, who clearly had no idea who we were. The message was clear: Marcus was to be kept at a distance from anyone who mattered in the Peterson social circle. The subtle exclusion continued throughout the evening. When the photographer gathered family for group pictures, my mother managed to position herself between Marcus and the rest of us, effectively blocking him from most shots. When my father's business partner expressed interest in Marcus's work after overhearing us talk about sustainable waste systems, my father quickly redirected the conversation to the champagne selection. Each small slight added to the smoldering anger I had been suppressing since discovering the Riverside connection. I watched my father charm guest after guest, playing the role of successful patriarch, while the truth of how some of that success had been achieved burned in my chest. After the elaborate dinner, as the dancing began, and the alcohol flowed more freely, my father's subtle digs became less subtle. While I was getting another drink at the bar, he approached, placing a firm hand on my shoulder. "Hazel, darling," he said, his voice slightly too loud from champagne. "Perhaps you could encourage your friend to mingle less with the Hamilton connections. Banking families tend to be rather traditional, you understand." "His name is Marcus, Dad," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "And he's my fiancé, not my friend." My father's smile tightened. "Of course. Just be mindful of the company you keep him in. This wedding represents important relationships for the family." Before I could respond, he was called away to toast with a group of golfing buddies, leaving me seething. Across the tent, I could see Marcus now sitting alone at our assigned table, politely watching the festivities, but excluded from participating in them. As the evening progressed, the alcohol loosened tongues and inhibitions. The orchestra played, couples danced, and the celebration took on the slightly frenzied energy of wealthy people, determined to have the exact right amount of fun appropriate for their social standing. I was returning from the restroom when I heard my father's voice louder than usual, addressing a cluster of his friends near the dessert table. One of them, a ruddy-faced man I recognized as his college roommate, was asking about me. "And what about your daughter's fellow Hazel's boyfriend? What line of work did you say he was in?" My father glanced around, not seeing me partially hidden by a floral arrangement. His laugh was dismissive, intended to diminish. "Oh, him. He's just a trash collector. Nothing to see there." Several in the group chuckled appreciatively at what they perceived as a witty put-down. My father encouraged continued. "Hazel always had a soft spot for charitable cases. Her little environmental phase." The casual cruelty of his words hit me like a physical blow. I stood frozen, watching these men laugh at Marcus, at me, at our life's work. Across the room, I could see that Marcus had heard too. His face remained composed, but I saw the subtle stiffening of his shoulders, the careful way he set down his glass. In that moment, something broke inside me. The careful balance I had maintained between my Seattle life and my family obligations shattered. The facts I had discovered about Riverside, combined with this public humiliation, crystallized into a clarity I had never experienced before. Before I could second guess myself, I was moving toward the small stage where the orchestra was taking a break. The wedding planner was nearby supervising the cutting of the massive cake. I approached her with such purpose that she immediately handed me the microphone she was holding, assuming I was about to offer an approved toast. The feedback from the microphone caused a momentary hush in the crowd. My mother's face, when she spotted me standing on stage, transformed from social smile to horror. Jeffrey and Sophia paused in their conversation with her parents, turning curiously toward the sound. My father, still laughing with his friends, hadn't yet noticed the shift in the room's energy. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice when it came was steady and clear. "I'd like to say a few words about my brother and his beautiful bride." I began, causing my mother's expression to relax marginally. "Jeffrey has always been the golden child of our family, following the Peterson tradition of success." Approving nods around the room. My father finally turned, raising his glass in my direction, assuming this would be a conventional toast. But today, I'd also like to talk about what success really means, and about honesty, which Jeffrey has always valued. The subtle shift in my tone caused my father's smile to falter. Jeffrey was watching me intently now, a question in his eyes. "Many of you have met my fiancé, Marcus Johnson. Some of you may have heard he works in waste management, and dismissed him as my father just did when he called Marcus just a trash collector." A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. My mother took a step forward, but my father placed a restraining hand on her arm, his eyes now fixed on me with growing alarm. "What you haven't heard is that Marcus holds master's degrees from Oregon State and MIT. He holds 3 patents for sustainable waste processing systems that are being implemented in cities across the country. His innovations have reduced landfill use by 40% in Seattle and saved municipalities millions in processing costs." I could see Marcus standing now, his expression a mixture of surprise and something else I couldn't quite read. Pride, perhaps. But more importantly, 15 years ago, Marcus worked under Walter Green, the environmental engineer, who supervised the cleanup of a toxic waste site known as the Riverside Project. My father's face drained of color. Several of his business associates exchanged glances, recognition flickering in their eyes. For those who don't know, Riverside was a development where illegal dumping of hazardous materials contaminated the groundwater in a working-class neighborhood. The responsible company hid behind a subsidiary called Riverside Holdings LLC. The room had gone completely still. Even the servers had paused, trays in hand. That subsidiary belonged to Peterson Development Corporation, my father's company. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, whether in shock at the revelation or my public airing of it, I couldn't tell. The settlement was sealed by the court, but the cleanup cost millions and took years. While Marcus was helping repair the damage to that community, my father's company was using the profits from cutting those environmental corners to build this estate we're standing on. My voice grew stronger as I continued, the weight of secrets lifting with each word. "So when you hear my father dismiss Marcus as just a trash collector, know that he's talking about the man who helped clean up his company's mess. The man whose work protects communities from exactly the kind of damage that built the Peterson fortune." I looked directly at my father, now meeting his gaze for perhaps the first time as equals. I've spent my life trying to understand why I never felt I belonged in this family. Now I know. It wasn't that I failed to live up to Peterson's standards. It's that those standards were built on values I could never accept. The microphone trembled in my hand as I concluded. "Jeffrey, Sophia, I truly wish you happiness. I hope your marriage is built on honesty and respect, unlike so much of what I've witnessed tonight." With that, I set down the microphone and stepped off the stage. The silence lasted only seconds before erupting into a chaos of voices. Some guests were standing in shock, others leaning to whisper urgently to their neighbors. My father remained frozen, face ashen. while my mother appeared to be having difficulty breathing. Marcus moved through the crowd toward me, his eyes never leaving mine. When he reached me, he said nothing, simply took my hand in his, a gesture of solidarity more powerful than words. We moved toward the exit, but our path was blocked by Jeffrey, who had detached himself from the stunned wedding party. His expression was unreadable as he faced us. Jeff, I began, suddenly uncertain. Had I gone too far? Ruined his special day beyond repair. To my shock, Jeffrey pulled me into a tight hug. I always wondered why Dad refused to discuss Riverside whenever I asked about it. He whispered, "Is it true?" I nodded against his shoulder. "I have the evidence." When he released me, I saw something new in my brother's eyes, respect tinged with sadness. "Go," he said quietly. "I'll handle things here." As we walked out, my father finally broke from his paralysis, striding toward us with fury in every line of his body. "Hazel Elizabeth Peterson!" he bellowed. "You will explain yourself this instant." Before I could respond, Jeffrey stepped between us. "Not now, Dad. We need to talk, but not here." Other voices joined the fray. Sophia's father demanding to know if the accusations were true. My mother pleading for discretion. Guests watching the unfolding drama with expressions ranging from horror to poorly concealed delight at the scandal. Marcus and I continued walking out of the tent across the perfect lawn and through the gardens until we reached the circular driveway where cars were parked. Only then did he speak. "Are you okay?" he asked simply. I took a deep breath of the cool night air, surprisingly clear-headed, despite the enormity of what had just happened. "Actually, yes. For the first time in this house, I think I am." As we slipped into our rental car and drove away from the Peterson estate, I glanced back at the glowing tent, the silhouettes of guests still visible through the fabric. I had just upended my family's carefully constructed world, and somehow I felt not regret, but relief. The reckoning had been a long time coming. Now we would all have to face the truth, however uncomfortable it might be. The dashboard clock read 1:17 a.m. When Marcus and I finished packing our belongings in the hotel room we'd hastily checked into after leaving the wedding. Neither of us had spoken much during the drive, or while methodically folding clothes into suitcases. The weight of what had happened hung between us, not as tension, but as a shared understanding that something monumental had shifted. My phone had been buzzing incessantly with notifications. Text messages from distant relatives expressing shock. Voicemails from my mother cycling between fury and tearful pleas. Several missed calls from Jeffrey. I had silenced it after reading his text. "I need to talk to you. Not mad. Call when you can." Sitting on the edge of the hotel bed, I finally broke the silence. "I'm sorry I didn't warn you before I did that." Marcus zipped his suitcase and sat beside me. "Don't be. You spoke your truth. That never requires an apology." "I just couldn't stand it anymore," I said, the words tumbling out. "Watching him dismiss you, dismiss what we both do, while knowing that his wealth came partly from the exact environmental crimes we've dedicated our careers to fighting." "I know." Marcus took my hand, his thumb tracing circles on my palm. "The question is, what happens now?" Our flight back to Seattle wasn't until late the following evening. We had booked it intentionally to allow time for post-wedding family brunch, a laughable concept now. I picked up my phone, scrolling through the barrage of messages until I found Jeffrey's again. "I think I need to talk to my brother," I said. "He deserves that much." Marcus nodded. "Want me to come with you?" "No," I decided after a moment. "This conversation needs to be just between us." I called Jeffrey, surprised when he answered immediately despite the late hour. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. "Shouldn't I be asking you that I just blew up your wedding reception?" "The reception was already winding down," he said with surprising lightness. "You just gave everyone something to talk about during the after-parties." His attempt at humor touched me. "Jeff, I'm so sorry. I never meant to take away from your day." "I know that, Hayes." He sighed, and I could picture him running a hand through his hair as he always did when troubled. "Listen, can we meet in the morning? There's a lot I want to ask you about." We arranged to meet at a coffee shop in town, neutral ground away from the estate. When I hung up, Marcus was watching me with quiet support in his eyes. "Try to get some sleep," he said, pulling back the covers. "Tomorrow will be another long day." Sleep came surprisingly easily, the emotional exhaustion finally catching up with me. I woke to sunlight streaming through unfamiliar curtains and the scent of coffee. Marcus had already been out and returned with breakfast. "You have a meeting to get to," he reminded me gently. "I'll stay here and look into changing our flights. The sooner we get back to Seattle, the better." The coffee shop was a small local place I remembered from high school, far from the upscale establishments my parents frequented. Jeffrey was already there when I arrived, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater rather than his usual business attire. For a moment, seeing him stirred memories of childhood before expectations, and different paths had created distance between us. He stood when he saw me, pulling me into a hug without hesitation. "You look like you actually slept," he observed as we sat down with our coffees. "That's more than I can say for most of the family." "How bad is it?" I asked, bracing myself. Jeffrey's expression grew serious. "Dad's lawyers have been working all night. Mom's taken to her bed with what she's calling a migraine, but is probably a panic attack about social fallout. Sophia's parents are demanding explanations." And Sophia, a small smile touched his lips. "Sophia is remarkable. She told her father that she married me, not my family's past, and that if there were issues to address, we would face them together." Relief flooded through me. "I'm glad. She seems like she truly loves you." "She does." Jeffrey stirred his coffee absently. "But I didn't ask you here to talk about my marriage. I want to know about Riverside. Everything you know." I took a deep breath and laid it all out. The calendar notation that had triggered my suspicions, the research I'd done, the connection to Marcus's mentor, the sealed settlement and environmental devastation that had been quietly buried with money and legal maneuvering. Jeffrey listened intently, asking occasional sharp questions that reminded me he hadn't succeeded in business by being unobservant. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I always knew there were aspects of the business Dad kept compartmentalized," he finally said. "Projects he handled personally with separate legal teams. But I never pushed for details. It was easier not to know." The admission clearly cost him. Jeffrey had always been the perfect son, the one who embraced the Peterson legacy without question. "What will you do now?" I asked. He looked out the window, his profile so like our father's, yet somehow more open, less hardened. "I need to know exactly what happened. What other corners were cut? What other communities might have suffered?" His gaze returned to me, resolve evident. "I can't undo what was done, but I can make sure it never happens again under my leadership." "Dad won't make that easy," I warned. "No, he won't," Jeffrey agreed. "But Sophia and I have been talking all night. The company we build together has to be one we're proud to pass on to our children someday." The mention of future nieces and nephews made me smile despite everything. "You'll be a great father, Jeff." "I hope so." He reached across the table to take my hand. "And I hope that whatever happens with Mom and Dad, you and I don't lose each other again." "We won't," I promised. Different paths doesn't have to mean broken connection. We talked for another hour, reminiscing about childhood memories and carefully navigating around the raw edges of the previous night's revelations. As we prepared to leave, Jeffrey handed me a small envelope. "What's this?" I asked, opening it to find a check with a startling number of zeros. "Your portion of grandmother's trust," he explained. "Dad's been managing it since she passed, but it's legally yours. I had the accountants prepare this last week as a wedding gift, but it seems more appropriate now. Financial independence from the family might be helpful in the coming months." I stared at the check, emotions swirling. This wasn't Peterson development money, but our grandmother's inheritance. Still, the amount was life-changing. "Thank you," I said simply, knowing Jeffrey understood all the complexities behind those two words. We parted with another hug and promises to talk soon. Back at the hotel, Marcus was on his laptop, having successfully changed our flights to depart that evening. When I told him about the conversation and showed him the check, he whistled softly. "That's a significant show of support from your brother." "It's more than money," I agreed. "It's him choosing truth over comfort." As we prepared to leave Connecticut, my phone rang with my mother's number. After a moment's hesitation, I answered. "Hazel." Her voice was tight with controlled emotion. "What you did was unconscionable." "What Dad did was unconscionable," I countered. The public humiliation of Marcus was just the final straw. You've always been so dramatic, she sighed. Your father may have been tactless, but to destroy the family reputation over a perceived slight to your boyfriend. Fiancé, I corrected automatically. And this isn't about hurt feelings, Mom. It's about environmental crimes that hurt real people. Communities that suffered while we lived in luxury. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if she'd hung up. Your father is a complicated man, she finally said, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. He's built everything we have through sheer determination. And cutting corners that harmed others, I added quietly. Another long pause. Will you be speaking to journalists about this? Of course, her concern was about public relations, not ethics. That's not my intention, but I won't lie if asked directly. I see. Her tone had returned to its usual controlled precision. Then I suppose we'll all have to live with the consequences of your principles. The call ended without a proper goodbye, typical of my mother when displeased. I set the phone down, feeling a strange mixture of sadness and liberation. Are you okay? Marcus asked the question, becoming our touchstone through this upheaval. I think I will be, I replied honestly. For the first time in my life, I'm not trying to be two different people anymore. Our departure from Connecticut felt symbolic, leaving behind not just a geographical location, but the weight of unspoken expectations and compromises that had shadowed me for years. As the plane lifted off, Marcus squeezed my hand. Whatever comes next, we face it together, he said. I rested my head on his shoulder, exhausted, but oddly peaceful. Together sounds perfect. What came next unfolded over months rather than days. Back in Seattle, we resumed our work, but echoes from Connecticut followed. An anonymous tip to environmental authorities about other potential violations at Peterson development projects prompted investigations in 3 states. Jeffrey called weekly, updating me on the internal audit he had quietly initiated and the resistance he was facing from our father and the board. Sophia had proven to be an unexpected ally, her family's old money influence providing some protection, as Jeffrey pushed for transparency. News eventually broke about the Peterson development environmental investigations. My name was never mentioned in connection with the anonymous tip, but industry insiders could connect the dots. Former colleagues of my father suddenly remembered meetings I had attended, where concerns were dismissed, calling to share their recollections with authorities. 6 months after the wedding, Jeffrey and Sophia made a surprise visit to Seattle. Over dinner at our apartment, my brother looked simultaneously exhausted and energized. The board finally agreed to a complete environmental compliance review, he announced, and we're establishing a foundation to fund cleanup and community health monitoring in neighborhoods affected by past projects. Dad can't be happy about that, I observed. Jeffrey's laugh held little humor. That's putting it mildly. But the legal exposure was becoming too great to ignore. This way the company survives even if its profit margins take a hit. And your relationship with Dad? I asked gently. Professional, Jeffrey said after a pause. He's still chairman, I'm still CEO. We focus on the business. Beyond that, he shrugged, the gesture conveying volumes. Later that evening, as Sophia and I washed dishes while the men talked on the balcony, she surprised me with a warm hug. Thank you, she said. For what? For giving Jeffrey the chance to be his own man, not just Arthur Peterson's son. Her eyes, when she pulled back, were clear and direct. It hasn't been easy, but he's becoming the person he was meant to be. A week later, my mother called, her voice lacking its usual crisp efficiency. Your father and I have been doing some thinking, she began without preamble. We'd like to come visit, to see your life in Seattle. The request was so unexpected, I nearly dropped the phone. Really? Unless you'd prefer we didn't, she added quickly, vulnerability unusual in her tone. No, that would be nice, I managed, signaling to Marcus across the room. When were you thinking? Plans were made for a visit the following month. When I hung up, Marcus raised an eyebrow. Your parents want to visit, voluntarily. Should I alert the authorities about flying pigs? I laughed, but there was an undercurrent of hope I couldn't quite suppress. Maybe people can change. A little. The visit itself was awkward, but not disastrous. My father was subdued, his customary confidence dimmed by the ongoing investigations and Jeffrey's independence. My mother made visible efforts to engage with Marcus, asking genuine questions about his work for the first time. On their final evening over dinner at a restaurant overlooking Puget Sound, my father cleared his throat during a lull in conversation. "I've been doing some reading about your waste processing system," he said to Marcus, the first direct acknowledgement of his career. "The efficiency metrics are impressive." Marcus nodded, neither overly eager for approval nor dismissive of the olive branch. "Thank you. We're seeing good implementation results across several municipalities." My father nodded, then turned to me. "Hazel, I—" He paused, clearly struggling. What I said at the wedding was inexcusable, and what the company did at Riverside was worse. It wasn't exactly an apology, but coming from Arthur Peterson, it was unprecedented. I met his gaze steadily. "Thank you for acknowledging that." The rest of the evening progressed with cautious conversation, careful to avoid both confrontation and artificial pleasantries. When we parted at their hotel, my mother hugged me with unusual fierceness. "We raised you to have conviction," she whispered. "I forget sometimes that you learned that lesson too well." 1 year after the wedding that changed everything, Marcus and I were planning our own ceremony, a small gathering on the shores of Puget Sound with close friends and carefully selected family. Jeffrey would stand as my witness, while Marcus's mentor, Walter Green, would be his best man, a full-circle moment that felt right. The Peterson family had changed irrevocably. My father stepped down as chairman, retaining board membership, but ceding operational control entirely to Jeffrey. The company had weathered the investigations with significant financial penalties, but had emerged with a new commitment to sustainability that was more than just marketing language. My mother had surprised everyone by becoming involved in restoration projects in communities affected by past Peterson developments. Whether driven by genuine remorse or a desire to rehabilitate the family name was unclear, but the work itself was making a difference. Marcus and I continued our environmental work, his patents gaining wider adoption, and my research contributing to policy changes at the state level. The check Jeffrey had given me remained largely untouched, set aside in a foundation to support environmental education in underserved communities. As I reviewed final plans for our wedding, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. Standing up in that reception tent had been terrifying, but the truth, however painful, had ultimately freed all of us from the weight of secrets and pretense. My family would never be perfect, the damage of the past never completely erased, but there was healing in honesty and the courage to face consequences. The night before our wedding, Marcus and I walked along the beach where we would exchange vows the next day. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked as we watched the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and pink. I considered the question carefully. I regret the timing that it had to happen at Jeffrey's wedding, but not the truth itself. That needed to come to light. Marcus nodded, pulling me close against the evening chill. "Your father asked me something interesting when they visited. He wanted to know what I saw in you that first day we met." "What did you tell him?" "That I saw someone who cared more about doing what was right than what was easy or profitable. Someone who looked at a contaminated site and saw not a liability, but potential for healing." His voice softened. I told him that's what makes you a Peterson worth being proud of, though not for the reasons he always thought. I leaned into his embrace, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart against my cheek. Tomorrow, we would begin our married life together, building something based not on appearances or status, but on shared values and authentic purpose. The waves continued their eternal conversation with the shore, a reminder that even the most solid-seeming structures can be transformed with enough time and persistent truth. Some things must be broken down before they can be rebuilt stronger and more honest than before. Have you ever had to expose a difficult truth about someone close to you? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments. The strength it takes to stand up for what's right, even when it costs us something personally, is worth sharing. Like and subscribe if you've ever had to make the hard choice between family loyalty and personal integrity. Remember that sometimes the most painful moments lead to the most necessary growth. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you the courage to live your truth, whatever that means for you.